Today I'd like to continue our journey through the book of Joshua. We're up to chapter 5 of that historical book, the book that takes us really from the pilgrimage in the desert, and now we're entering into the promised land. It's a land that is described as a land flowing with milk and honey. Uh, the rainfall in the land is going to give the grass, nurture the grass for the cows, so that will produce the milk. And the flowers in this land will be wonderful for the bees, and this way we will have that delicious honey that we all love. Now, Joshua now orders that all of the males be circumcised, as they were not circumcised in the desert. So they are circumcised now at Gilgal, similar in sound to the Hebrew word Galathai, which means I have removed. Gilgal probably means the place of the circle of standing stones, because the stones were taken from the River Jordan and placed there, the 12 stones for the 12 tribes. The problem, of course, with this circumcision happening at this time in chapter 5 is that you need a certain amount of recovery time from the circumcision. So if all these males are being circumcised, they're not going to be really ready to go into battle. So we think the author is trying to make the point that they couldn't have been circumcised in the desert because of the traveling conditions. Now they should be circumcised going into the promised land, but exactly when this circumcision took place in terms of the battles would be up for discussion. And it really is put here in the book of Joshua because of the proximity to the Passover celebration that we've seen, because only the circumcised could partake in the Passover. So the thought would be that they have to get their circumcision before the Passover, so that's why we see it here in chapter 5. So the people now celebrate the Passover at Gilgal. It was the 14th of the first month, the month of Nisan. On the day after the celebration of Passover, the people ate of the produce of the land, and the manna ceased. So there was no need now for the manna because they were eating off the produce of the land. But again, in terms of the time frame here, we could be a little bit off because they're just getting into the promised land. How could they eat off of the promised land? Were they getting food from the people there? All of that isn't clear. But the idea is that once they get into now the promised land, they've crossed over the River Jordan with Joshua. Really no need anymore for the manna. So Joshua has an encounter now with the captain of the host of the Lord at the end of chapter 5, and he bows down and he goes to the ground in worship. And the captain of the host tells Joshua to remove his sandals because he is on holy ground. So the idea of this really theophany, this encounter from God, kind of validates Joshua as leader. So this encounter happens before there's really any battles. The people are entering into the promised land at this point. So in chapter 6, the Lord orders Joshua to have all of the soldiers march around Jericho now for 6 days, and 7 priests are to carry the ram's horns ahead of the ark. So we have the ark, we have the people marching for 6 days, and the 7 priests, again 7, the Hebrew number of completion or perfection, they're going to be carrying the ram's horns to blow as a sign of reverence for the Ark of the Covenant. Now, on the 7th day, they're to march around the city 7 times and have the priests blow the horns. So 6 days, they're marching, but on the 7th day, now it's an additional time. It's a 7th time marching around the city of Jericho. And when the priests give a long blast on the ram's horns, all the people shall also shout out loud, and then the wall of the city will collapse, and the Israelite soldiers can do a frontal attack. So that is the battle plan. That when this noise happens, the people are shouting, and they've been marching around the walls. The walls are going to collapse, and they can kind of march right in, and they can take Jericho. The only problem, of course, with this account is that the walls in Jericho from the archaeological remains seem to have been destroyed about 200 years earlier. but they probably were still settlers in the area. Might have been some structures, and certainly the idea of getting ready for the battle, because this would have been the typical way people would get ready for the battle. They would be marching, there would be the horns blowing, the people would be shouting, again to strike fear and strike terror in the opposition. The soldiers were told then not to harm Rahab because of Rahab's earlier cooperation with the spies, and also anyone in her house, and not to take the silver and gold and the articles of bronze and iron. These were to be put into the treasury, and of course that's a little bit anachronistic because the temple was built later and the treasury of the temple came later. But again, this is to show the importance of the temple in the worship life of the people right early on as they enter into the promised land. This is extremely important, and this should go into the treasury. Where it went, probably into some special area that Joshua designated, and then, of course, later on, probably into the temple of the treasury when the temple was built, when it was constructed, finally constructed under the reign of Solomon. Now, when the horns blew, as Joshua instructed, the people raised this large shout, and the walls collapsed. This was ascribed to the power of God. The horns and the shout were a sign of the obedience of the people. So really the key element in this story, not so much the walls falling down and the people marching around and all of that, the shouting. The key element that the writer wants to get across here is the obedience of the people. The people are listening to God. They're listening to what God wants. When they follow God's ways and God's paths, good things will happen. The soldiers then observed the ban. They put to the sword all living creatures in the city, men and women, young and old, and also the oxen, the sheep, and the asses. And the concept of the ban was based on the idea that the evil that was there had to be eliminated, because unless that evil was eliminated, it could affect the people of God. We see the ban mentioned many times in the Hebrew scriptures. Exactly how extensive this was is debated by commentators back and forth. Some say it's a bit of an exaggeration. We don't know exactly, but it was fairly typical of the warfare of the time. Joshua then spared Rahab and her entire family, but the rest of the city was burned. And Joshua then placed a curse upon Jericho. He said, anyone who attempts to rebuild the city will lose his firstborn son when he lays the foundation, shall lose his youngest son when he sets up the gates. This curse was fulfilled when Hillel rebuilt Jericho during the reign of Ahab, king of Israel. So as Hillel rebuilt that city, this is exactly what happened to him. So it's kind of a fulfillment of the curse later on. And of course, is this one of the stories that is planted here because of what happened to Hillel later on? Again, commentators would say that it was well planned that this be put here so that that story could prove true. Joshua's fame spread after the victory. So obviously, after this victory, everybody's excited. The people are excited. The Israelites are excited. We won this victory. We now can occupy Jericho. We get our first little foothold in the Promised Land, and we'll see how this leads to other skirmishes in the land of Canaan in the book of Joshua.